Now, let's tell you about this story. Now, while the country's economy is battling to stay afloat amid rolling blackouts, the rising cost of living, unemployment, the Institute of Race Relations believes it has a solution. The organization says the country's biggest economic downturn in history has largely been under the watch of President Cyril Ramaphosa. He says Ramaphosa should start by selling off Kusile and Medupi power stations in order to pay off Eskom's debt burden. Well, let's get more understanding about this call from Gabriel Crousse, the head of campaigns at the Institute of Race Relations. Good afternoon, Gabriel. Welcome to eNCA this afternoon. Sell off Kusile and Medupi. Why, really?
Yes, I think it's a great idea. It's not my own idea. I got it from the former Director General of Treasury, Dona Mokhojane, who's chairperson of the Government Employee Pension Fund, who said last year that they had been telling Eskom, why don't you sell off Medupi and Kusile? The reasons it's a good idea is that those two power stations are basically incomplete. They've never come close to reaching their capacity. Of course, Medupi last year, there was a huge blow up. The reason for this is that they're extremely complicated projects where many different suppliers are providing many different parts that have to enmesh with one another, and managing that project is just beyond the capacity of the South African government. Getting a private actor in there would increase the capacity, and putting them both to capacity would release maybe 4, 5, maybe even 6,000 megawatts, and that would go a very long way to addressing load shedding. The second aspect is if you sold them even for a third of the cost of production, they cost 300 billion to produce. Sell them at 150 billion, even 100 billion. You can immediately use that to pay off some of Eskom's debt. And Eskom's debt is the main drag on the sovereign credit rating. So we go from double junk to single junk. That means interest rates come down. That means it's easier for people to pay back their home loans. It's easier for businesses to borrow, create more business, create more jobs. Unemployment's the biggest problem in the country, and load shedding and Eskom debt together are the biggest causes. Sell Medupi and Kusile, you can solve both, hit two birds with one stone. The only problem is the government has to admit that someone in the private sector might be better at doing the job.
Yeah, and when you say that, and as you are talking, I'm looking at a report that has come in the past about the billions of rand into several hundreds of billions of rand spent extra on Medupi and Kusile. And in that proposal, if government were to do it, they'll earn themselves a big chunk of money and take off the responsibility of fixing what has gone wrong. For example, all those design defects at Kusile and so on.
Exactly right. I mean, I think that sale would, of course, the first thing we would have to do is get independent experts on site looking at what's going on. I think I'm familiar with the report you're referring to, but we'd want to get a valuation. The South African taxpayer deserves to get as much as possible out of it. And, you know, if the design flaws are so bad that they need to lift up some of those boilers and sell them off or replace them, use the stacks for a slightly different arrangement, so be it. But whatever the solution is, whatever the fastest way is to add capacity, to add power that's coming out and to decrease the debt burden, it's going to be coming from the private sector. You know, in some ways, I'm very proud South African, and I, as a childhood lover of the ANC, I would have loved to have seen them be able the government be able to run this project properly within budget, within time frame, but that hasn't happened. It's not looking like it's going to happen. There's no real confidence that we can have with the changing of the guard. It'd just be much simpler, better, faster, to use that old phrase, to hand this over to the private sector. But of course,
But Gabriel, some people, Gabriel, sorry to come in there. Some people might argue that privatization or selling of Kusile and Medupi to the private hands might not be a solution. Similarly, you know, on the other hand, throwing money at the problem might not really resolve it too quickly. We've seen government putting in billions and billions, yet Kusile and Medupi are not giving us power optimally as they are supposed to be, and it's still going to cost us more money. And government, ANC government might say its mandate, it believes, from the electorate is to have a developmental approach to the economy, and they believe that they need to hold on to energy. How would you counter that?
I say in response to that two things. Firstly, clearly it's the case that they're not able to do it right now. So instead of, I'm not saying, sorry, the first point is that very clearly the government's not able to produce this necessary capacity to supply the South African need. So everybody agrees, including the ANC, that independent power producers need to come into play. I'm just saying that this is one place that they can come into play that Dr. Mokhojane recommended that the ANC is not really comfortable with, but they should be. The second point is, I'm not suggesting, no one's suggesting that they should sell off all power production, all coal-fired power stations in one go. I think that would be a drastic step. I think that would create the opportunity for the private sector to come in and do rent seeking, use its monopoly advantage in order to make sure that it can extract a much higher price than is reasonable. Instead, by selling 2 power stations, you're selling basically 10,000 megawatts of capacity, but Eskom will still be in charge of 30,000 odd megawatts of capacity, and they can then, the government can focus, can consolidate the skills that are inside of Eskom and make sure that the remaining power stations that they have, which will still be by far the majority, are running at the best possible capacity. So to my mind, this is like a common sense in-between solution. These are the 2 most complicated, most difficult to run machines. Hand that over to the experts. In fact, don't hand it, sell it over. Use that money to pay down the debt. Use the skills that you've got in Eskom. Of course, there's skilled people at Eskom already. Redirect them, redeploy them, make sure that they're maximizing their energies. Use some of that money to pay for extra maintenance, get the whole thing going together. Don't abandon the mandate. No one is going to convince the ANC that it must privatize everything. That's a crazy idea. Instead, we must go in a reasonable fashion, in a consolidated fashion, and this would release perhaps 100 billion, perhaps 200 billion rand. On top of that, just one last thing. This falls within the broader project of trying to implement the Zondo recommendation that at Eskom and at all state-owned enterprises, the government must figure out, is it going to prioritize political objectives like BEE, like localization, like making sure the government's running it instead of private sector operators, or is it going to prioritize maximizing value for money? And the Zondo report made the very clear recommendation. It said all organs of state are advised to implement a maximum value for money criteria. So Eskom should also get rid of localization. It should get rid of preferential procurement. It should get rid of preferential employment. It should just be doing whatever is going to most quickly and most cost effectively get power to the people, real power, electric power, the kind of power that makes jobs happen.